code for the last session, the 5 myths of Cepheus, was Austin. So I'm especially excited about our next session. So our academics really struggle, and I told them they would have 10 minutes only to present to you on their work. But we selected a few academics who we felt their work was especially relevant to practitioners, to all of you in the room, all of you over Zoom. But I think when you do limit them to 10 minutes, the results are pretty magical. So I'm excited about this. I'm going to ask our academics to come out to the stage, and I'll introduce them. Okay, first up, are the MVP of the conference back again, Afra Afsharipour, Senior Associate Dean and Professor at UC Davis School of Law. Mark Brilliant, who is a professor in the History Department at UC Berkeley, and Panos Patatoukas, who is a professor at the University of California, Berkeley, Haas School of Business. And we're going to actually kick things off with a video presentation first on the governance of crypto networks from Steve McKeon of the University of Oregon.
Hi, I'm Steve McKeon. I'm an associate professor at the University of Oregon and delighted to be joining you today to chat for a few minutes about a different type of governance, decentralized autonomous organizations. So, I'll jump right in. Now, the underpinning of this technology is a concept called minimally extractive coordination. And it really comes down to this idea of when a group of people seeks to accomplish a complex task, and that could be almost anything, they require a coordination mechanism. So examples are determining who owns what, like maintaining a ledger, or processing payments is another example. Blockchain protocols coordinate these types of activities in a minimally extractive environment. And so that concept is really the underpinning of DAOs, or decentralized autonomous organizations, that I'm going to discuss today. So many of us in our PhD programs read Jensen and Mecklin, 1976, almost half a century old. And there's a famous quote that says, "It is important to recognize that most organizations are simply legal fictions which serve as a nexus for a set of contracting relationships among individuals." So when you think about legal contracting, a large segment of contracting can be boiled down to conditions for value flows. So pay the employee conditional on work being provided. Pay the vendor conditional on delivery of an input to production. You would expect payment from the customer conditional on delivery of the good or service. So what we are now going to talk about are smart contracts, which are in some ways analogous to legal contracts, but also have some important differences. So a smart contract is software that dictates conditions for value flows. So in that respect, very similar to legal contracts. However, importantly, it has dominion over the assets, and so it can actually effectuate the value flow. That's a very important difference. Smart contracts automate the contracting environment. So, for example, you could have a rule hard-coded in that says if a majority of interests vote in favor of a proposal, then deploy capital to the wallet specified in the proposal. There are sort of no other conditions that need to be met. If that single condition is met, the value moves. All right, so again, value flows that are based on conditions. So just to draw this analogy a little further, if firms are a nexus of legal contracts, DAOs are a nexus of smart contracts. So while firms rely on ex post monitoring and enforcement, we rely on the legal layer to sort of enforce many of these contracts. DAOs rely on ex ante governance mechanisms, so ex ante hard-coded rules. So Google had a famous slogan for many years that said, "Don't be evil." That's something we would need to rely on with firms, is that the management and the stewards of the capital aren't evil, and if they do misbehave, then we have a variety of ex post mechanisms to employ. With DAOs, it's closer to a can't be evil situation, because all of these rules are hard-coded in ex ante, and so malfeasance can't occur in the first place. So to draw some analogies, many times I'm asked sort of what is a DAO, right? So what would you compare this to in the real world? So Some people would call it an online community with a bank account. I've heard a subreddit with a bank account. Others have said an LLC that lives in the cloud. I think the best description of a DAO is that DAOs are the organizational form that are native to the internet. So let's walk through a simple example of a DAO. So an early DAO was called the LAO, the Legal Autonomous Organization. It's a group of about 50 or 60 investors. We each deposited capital into a smart contract. We elected a coordinator to manage the activity. They're paid by the smart contract. And potential investments are posted. We vote using our digital wallets. And if a majority of members vote in favor of a proposal, the value is automatically transferred or deployed to the recipient, which is typically a venture capital type investment. So what frictions do DAOs relax? In other words, why are these things important? Well, I go back to a quote from Arrow 1972. It says, virtually every commercial transaction has within itself an element of trust. And what DAOs do is that they allow for capital formation in a trust-minimized environment. So once capital is deployed or deposited into the smart contract, it cannot be deployed without consensus. Again, it relies on the fact that there are hard-coded rules in the software that regulate how the capital is deployed. So, for example, the members of the LAO didn't know each other, but this wasn't a problem because the software provided for the internal controls. So DAOs also facilitate streamlined decentralized voting. So if you think about how we effectuate votes in corporations, there's a proxy process, e-proxy, or you're mailed a ballot. We have to do these things on sort of a periodic basis, say quarterly. With DAOs, ownership is instantly provable through your digital wallet, right? So at any time, the contract can look in your wallet and say, yes, you do have the tokens that prove you're a member of this DAO. Voting can then be executed in a costless and instant manner using the same digital wallet that possesses the ownership claim. So you don't have the proxy system. You simply can vote via your computer by signing with the digital wallet that holds the ownership claim. The other important thing is that voting can be delegated, and it can be delegated dynamically, which means that if I decide that I don't want to vote, but I believe that there's somebody else who's more informed than me, I can delegate my vote to them. And if at some point I decide they're not representing my interests, I can redelegate the vote to someone else. So there's no elections. You can just delegate dynamically depending on who you want to represent your interests in the DAO. Now, there are a variety of challenges with DAOs. And I think this is where a lot of the academic work is focused at this point. The first is that decentralized governance is hard. As we know from many, many years of corporate governance literature, there's free rider problems. If you have a large body of atomistic owners or token holders, in the case of DAOs, many of those folks are not going to be incentivized to actually bear the cost of becoming informed. Now, one solution to this potentially is delegation, as I mentioned a few minutes ago. But what we haven't entirely figured out is how compensation for the delegates should be organized. Should the delegates be compensated by the protocol? Should they be compensated by the person who's doing the delegation? And then again, what incentive does that person have to pay for informed vote? And so there's a lot of work going on around how to facilitate informed voting in these environments. The second challenge is that these are trust minimized but not trustless. You still have to trust the code. You have to trust that there's no bugs in the code. You have to trust that there's no technical errors. The tools to actually make that assessment are not fully developed at this point. Much like if you're going to sign a legal contract, you would hire a lawyer to review that legal contract and tell you what's in it. We believe that someday there will be tools that can review smart contracts and summarize in layman terms what's in it for the potential participant. The third is liability. These are not legal entities. These sort of only exist in the cloud, as I mentioned. It's unclear if there was some sort of claim against a DAO, whether the members would be personally liable, whether the software developers would be liable. That's a huge body of work at this point. The fourth is lack of legal recognition. So DAOs effectively have no jurisdiction. They only live in the cloud. The capital is pooled from all over the world. However, there is now a first mover in the form of Wyoming that has now formally recognized DAOs using the existing LLC framework. And so we believe that that will be sort of a roadmap for more jurisdictions, not just in the US, but around the world, to start recognizing DAOs as legal entities. And then the last is this concept of hard versus soft information. Hard information is very objective. Those are very easy to insert into smart contracts, right? Because it's typically a yes or no answer. It's not subjective in nature. Soft information is subjective. So something like, did the agent produce a best effort, right? So somebody has to determine that. And so there's a whole body of work around a concept called subjective oracles, which I don't have time to go into today, but those are just some high-level challenges that are present in DAOs. So I think that the takeaway point on DAOs is that these systems of smart contracts have produced some of the fastest decentralized capital formation in history. Capital flows from around the globe to an aggregation point nearly instantly with a few clicks of the mouse. So there are examples of smart contracts that have gone from zero to hundreds of millions of dollars in a matter of hours. And in fact, DAOs are now managing tens of billions of dollars, which of course is still just a blip in terms of the global financial system. But this really has all occurred in the last, I would say, 12 to 18 months. And so I hope that one of the things you take away is that this is an interesting new form of organization for which there are many legal questions, but it is scaling up very, very quickly. And if the trajectory continues, this is something you're going to be hearing a lot more about. So if I've only been able to scratch the surface here in 10 minutes. If you would like to dig in a little bit further on DAOs, I recommend a paper by Aaron Wright titled The Rise of Decentralized Autonomous Organizations, Opportunities and Challenges. There's another article by my colleague Alex Murray and several co-authors titled Contracting in the Smart Era, Implications of Blockchain and Decentralized Autonomous Organizations for Contracting and Corporate Governance. And if you care to read some non-academic articles, I post thoughts on Medium. You could just Google Medium Stephen McKeon, you'll come up, or the address is medium.com/@SBMcKeon.
Let me just start with thanking our hosts, Bickleby and the Cooley team, for a great couple of days. It's been a really interesting experience today. So corporations, law firms, and investment banks all state that diversity matters. But when it comes to some of their most transformational undertakings, M&A deals, there's a disconnect between discourse and action. In fact, for these types of decisions that are often the most important decisions that companies undertake, a gender gap persists. Now, earlier, we had former State Senator Hannah Beth Jackson talk a little bit about why do gender disparities matter. Let me talk just quickly about why gender disparities matter in M&A. So first, from an equity standpoint, a significant portion of the population does not hold key decision-making roles in fundamental deals that greatly impact companies and billions of dollars trading hands. Second, understanding gender disparities in M&A matter as we think more about ESG and ESG types of metrics. And third, research on group decision-making suggests that greater diversity could improve M&A transactions. M&A transactions are important transactions for companies, but research also suggests that M&A deals are plagued by shortcomings in decision-making. And I discuss this in the longer article, but a body of literature has begun to explore the connection between M&A outcomes and the lack of diversity among M&A decision makers, suggesting that greater diversity may be correlated with improved M&A outcomes. So my research here is really driven by the premise that understanding, documenting, and disclosing the gender gap in M&A leadership is critical for increasing accountability and for determining the solutions that may work to reduce such disparities. The other thing I would add before I get further into the paper is that this article, my work, focuses on the lack of gender diversity in M&A, but I would say that there's a significant and an equally glaring gap with respect to racial diversity in transactional practice generally. So undertaking a significant M&A deals, as we've talked about over the past few days, involves a lot of different institutions, whether it's the board of directors or a company's senior management, a myriad of advisors, and in the longer paper, I focus primarily on the role that the legal advisors and the financial advisors play. In essence, M&A involves a group of sophisticated actors working together to make complex, multifaceted decisions, exactly the types of decisions that research has indicated benefit from diverse perspectives. But whether as executives or as board members or as financial advisors or as legal advisors, women are vastly underrepresented in leadership positions. So to date, much of the scholarship and advocacy on diversity has really focused on board diversity. And we've talked a little bit about this, the various efforts to try and increase diversity on the board of directors, and we've made some headway over the past few years with respect to board diversity. Nevertheless, women's leadership on board roles lags behind their actual membership on board roles, and that has implications for M&A transactions. And arguably, there are other institutional players that might be perhaps even more important than the board with respect to the decision to undertake an M&A deal. But unlike board diversity, there's been relatively modest progress in the representation of women in the corporate pipeline, and women are severely underrepresented in the C-suite in most American companies. So 25% of C-suite positions are held by women, but when it comes to the CEO role, women make up only 6% of the CEOs in the Russell 3000. And the proportion of women in senior leadership roles really differs by role. Women are overrepresented in support functions like the head of human resources, while men tend to be concentrated in business development or operations, P&L responsibilities, research and development, all of the types of roles that are viewed as really critical to experiences to becoming the CEO. Financial advisors, which I talk about in greater depth in the paper, especially at the leadership level, resemble their clients. They're dominated by men. M&A advisory work, especially for the largest deals, is male-dominated, and only about 20% of leaders in investment banking are women. With respect to my work, one of the things that I do is I dive a little further into leadership roles with respect to the law firms, and I hand-collected data on the top 100 public company transactions in the US from 2014 to 2020. So an important indicator of status, power, and compensation in an M&A group is typically whether one gets listed as one of the corporate leaders on the deal. And one place where this information is publicly available is in the M&A contracts that have to be filed by public companies with the SEC on their Form 8K. So that's part of where my data comes from. But in addition to the data from the actual acquisition agreements, I, along with a team of research assistants, then collected data from press releases issued in connection with the transaction, as well as other information from law firms' own websites and each lawyer's specific bios, and if they were no longer at the firm, from their LinkedIn accounts and so forth. And what that analysis reveals is that 30 years after women have begun to account for more than half of all law students at law schools, a gender gap persists when it comes to M&A leadership. So if you take a look at the data that I have up on the slides, one of the things that you can see is that women's representation as lead corporate lawyer varies from year to year, but remains relatively low. So if you look at the information with respect to lead counsel for the buyer, there doesn't seem to be any kind of a linear pattern of increased or decreased representation of women in the lead counsel position during the time period that I studied, although it hovers at an average of about 10.5%. On the seller target side, the data shows an increase in the share of women who are listed as lead counsel from 2014 to 2020, and this increase is particularly pronounced starting in 2017. And in speaking with lawyers in practice, one of the things they say is anecdotally, this is one of the things that they've experienced in their practice as well. the percentage of women as lead counsel in this data set of 700 transactions is lower than that's what is reported for women partners generally at law firms. So if you look at the partnership rates with respect to the largest law firms, the National Association of Legal Professionals indicates that women make up about 25% of partners in large law firms. Now, one of the other things that I did in gathering the data is really focus on the leading law firms who are advising on M&A. So within the larger data set, there's about 146 law firms who were involved in the deal studied from 2014 to 2020. And I broke them up with respect to you guys being able to see the slides and the firms from number 1 to 10, and then with respect to numbers 11 through 20. And one of the things that you can see in terms of looking at the data is that the predominance of men as a lead counsel is not driven by one firm alone. Other than one firm in the data set, and I was not, did not speak to Cooley about this beforehand, but other than Cooley, every single one of the firms has significant disparities with respect to women in leadership roles. The most active firm within my data set who advised on 266 of the 700 transactions in the study was Wachtell Lipton. Wachtell Lipton named a total of 6 women, so 6 unique women in 13 different transactions over that entire 7-year period of time. Of the 10 most active law firms during the period studied, Skadden Arps and Kirkland and Ellis named the most number of unique women to their deal teams, but even then, men vastly outnumbered women in the total lead advisor role. Women were particularly underrepresented at 2 of the leading firms. Within the group of the top 10 firms in terms of number of deals, Davis Polk kind of stood out, which it named only 2 women to lead counsel positions from 2014 to 2020 compared to 81 men. And those 2 women were only listed in the 2020 data set. So when I first started working on the project, they had a total of 0. A second firm is Cleary Gottlieb, which also only has 2 women on the list. One substantial sort of change that I started to see in the data is the number of deal teams with at least 1 woman named as lead corporate partner, which seems to increase from 2014 to 2020. So in 2014, only about 19% of deals included at least 1 woman listed as a lead partner. That number rose to 30% in 2020. Although if you look at the number with respect to the number of deal teams that only have women named as lead counsel, that number kind of generally hovers at a little below 5% throughout the entire period of time. I'm going to take 10 seconds to just talk about a little bit about solutions. I go through a host of solutions in the paper, but one area that I stress, given my role as a law professor and as a dean at a law school, is to look at the representation that we offer to our own students about the potential for leadership in M&A. Very few women constitute the majority of the corporate law faculty at top 50 law schools. The two of the largest feeders into corporate law firms are Harvard Law School and Columbia Law School. Harvard has a total of 1 woman out of 11 full-time faculty members in corporate law. Columbia has 4 women out of 21 full-time faculty members in corporate law. And the same kind of disparities exist with respect to adjunct faculty teaching M&A classes specifically. So I'll finish with that. Penn is an outlier, and we won't talk about Berkeley.
Thanks, Afra. Well, good afternoon, everybody. I am your historical interlude, and the historical origins of the book project I want to talk about today that I'm just on the front end of writing up after spending a number of years doing the research originates in many ways in a class I've co-taught with Stephen for several years called Wall Street and Main Street. So I really have him to thank for the opportunity to develop some of those ideas, both in lectures and in conversations in lectures. And so in the process of teaching that class that I became interested in exploring the historical roots of what has become known in recent years. The veteran California journalist Dan Walters referred to it as the California paradox. And the idea there was that we live in a state with breathtaking technological innovation, supermajority Democratic Party domination, and acute income polarization. Now, the income polarization piece of that story is not unique to California, nor is it new. Sometime during the 1970s, the so-called Great Compression in income distribution, ushered in by the New Deal and then accelerated by World War II, began to reverse course. And this 1970s pivot from Great Depression to Great Divergence in income distribution marked the dawn of what has since become known as our new Gilded Age. In no state was this pivot more pronounced than California, as this 1999 PPIC report observed. This shift from golden state to gilded state, if you will, unfolded alongside two other watersheds in American economic and political history, for which California was also on the cutting edge. The first of these was the rise of Silicon Valley. The Silicon Valley USA article there is the first place where, as best we can tell, where the term was coined in print. And the second change that California was on the leading edge was the transformation of the Democratic Party. And that transformation was sort of described, or you can describe it now, as a transformation from the kind of New Deal liberalism associated with California Governor Pat Brown and toward the post-New Deal liberalism of his son, Jerry, which is reflected here in a firing line interview with William F. Buckley that Jerry did in his first year in office, in his first iteration as governor, in which he talks about the limits of liberalism. From the historian's perspective then, if you want to understand the contemporary roots of this phenomenon, you have to step back into the past. And that's what the book that I'm currently working on aspires to do. More specifically, and this is sort of my best attempt at a schematic, what I'm trying to do is to examine the interplay between what I call techno-optimism and state skepticism, and how it is that they together contributed to the rise of our so-called New Gilded Age, using California as a case study for this. So let me unpack those two terms and then talk about its relationship by way of one example, its connection to, that is, the New Gilded Age. With respect to techno-optimism, during the 1970s, no elected official appreciated and articulated the high hopes for high-tech better than Jerry Brown. For Brown, high-tech promised to help promote individual enlightenment, protect the planet from mounting environmental degradation, and of course, provide good jobs. Over the course of the 1970s, techno-optimism became increasingly mainstream. A great new job market was coming, Time magazine cheered in 1978, and its products, including those here on display, promised to make us wiser, healthier, and even happier. And that could not have been better timed. High-tech promised to do, right? This was the sort of the period, the front end of the period known as deindustrialization. And what high-tech promised for many people was the opportunity to do for manufacturing jobs that were being lost what manufacturing jobs had previously done for agricultural jobs that had been lost to mechanization. Now, as with techno-optimism, so too with state skepticism, which is to say that California led the way. The Times set the agenda, Jerry Brown would quip, and in a period of Vietnam, Watergate, stagflation, the mood, as Brown put it, was decisively not for government. And Brown's candidacy for governor in 1974 spoke to that mood, and his election signaled a major turn for the Democratic Party, as one commentator described it in 1974. a kind of ideological lurch in the direction of a more chastened view of state capacity that Brown's predecessor, Ronald Reagan, had popularized, and for which Brown represented a leading democratic variation. This state skepticism would soon find emphatic popular expression in the tax revolt. Sparked by California's Prop 13 in 1978, the tax revolt, of course, quickly spread across the country, which brings me to my attempt to sort of lay out a short provisional thesis to the book I'm working on. That is how I currently envision connecting the themes of techno-optimism and state skepticism to the rise of the new Gilded Age. It goes like this. The waxing of faith in high tech coincided with and indeed filled the vacuum created by the waning of faith in government. And in the context of the times, this combination of techno-optimism and state skepticism made good sense. An increasingly post-industrial economy and the people propelling it, the thinking went, could solve problems that government was either complicit in or ill-equipped for. In retrospect, though, the combination of techno-optimism and state skepticism had the unintended and largely unforeseen consequence of contributing to the transformation of Golden State to Gilded State. Policies reflective of state skepticism, often shaped by the state skepticism of techno-optimists themselves, checked the full realization of the promises of techno-optimism. And to help concretize this provisional thesis claim, I'll just conclude with an illustrative example. So on the one hand, leaders in government and industry called for equipping students with what Jerry Brown referred to as the 3 C's as opposed to the 3 R's. And by that he meant computing, calculating, and communicating. This would best prepare them for developing the so-called winning technologies of the future that Brown's Commission on Industrial Innovation envisioned in this 1982 report by that name. On the other hand, the tax revolt bled public schools of tax dollars, so much so that in 1983, San Jose's public schools, deep in the heart of Silicon Valley, not Detroit's in the Rust Belt, San Jose's schools declared bankruptcy, becoming the first district in the country to go belly up since the Great Depression. Peering into California's technological future just the year before, the Stanford Research Institute was commissioned by the state of California to write this report on the state's technological future. And in 1982, just the year before San Jose schools went bankrupt, it wrote, "Perhaps the most serious problem of the new information era is the conflict between the demands of an increasingly technically oriented economy and the current pattern of reductions in state support for education." And as that fear was coming to fruition in San Jose, one of the report's authors warned of a future of, quote, great wealth and luxury alongside great deprivation and poverty, a future of the information haves versus the information have-nots. Now, if that warning sounds a lot like the California paradox with which I began, well, it should, although it comes from decades before, and it comes in those critical years that I'm examining when that paradox first began to emerge, and the sort of lineage of that I hope to be able to trace in the book that I'm working on. What that has to do with going from the ivory tower to the boardroom, I can't really tell you other than maybe you'll read it in your board meetings when you're bored with what's going on in the boardroom. So on that note, thank you all.
All right, well, thank you very much. And I'm so excited to be here with you today and talk about our passion, financial education. Actually, after listening to Professor Brilliant's talk, I think I'm going to revise my title to the unintended implications of the information haves and have-nots, and what we can do as academics to mitigate the gap. So I want to talk about our vision of financial education for all, and this is joint work with Stephen. Let me share my vision, our vision. So first of all, in terms of what we do, we're in the business of intellectual arbitrage. So we're trying to get insights from different disciplines: accounting, finance, law, economics, data science, computer science, and I will argue there is so much that we can learn from each other. And over the last 2 days, this is more confirmation. The other idea is that it's time for us academics to move from theory to practice, and all the ideas that we develop in the classroom and in our research to disseminate to our community. And that's what's driving us. As financial educators, and financial education is relevant to everyone, what keeps us up at night is how can financial education facilitate individual investor decision-making? And we heard today the CEO of American Airlines talking about the rise of individual participation and how that can change corporate governance and shareholder voting. How can financial education help promote market efficiency? And ultimately, how can financial education help improve the allocation of capital in society so that we improve social welfare? Now, financial education matters, and of course, being in financial education, I believe that. And I think we believe that financial education matters even more today, because over the last 20 months, we've experienced the rise of this new generation of investors coming to markets and participating to a bigger degree through trading platforms like Robinhood, right? So we saw what happened with GameStop and the meme stocks with the rise of SPACs and the SPAC attacks. And this YOLO mentality, this idea that you only live once, so you might as well throw your lifetime savings into the stock market and see what comes out at the other end. Now, with the increased participation of investors in capital markets, there is a problem. And that problem is not as transparent, and that's what I want to describe to you. And that's the problem of access and equality, the haves and the have-nots, but it's a little bit more subtle. In modern capital markets, you have institutional investors and those that have access to models and vast data and people that have the expertise to crunch the data and make informed investment decisions. At the same time, you have this new generation of investors and these individual investors that they have access to trading, but at the same time, they don't have access to financial data, structured financial data analysis, and financial education. Not everybody has the means or the luck to end up at Berkeley in my class. Now, as a result, you have this increased discrepancy between institutional investors and individual investors, right? And that discrepancy is on the rise with increased participation. Individual investors, they realize that, and they're asking for more. They're hungry for more inclusive financial education. And that's where we come in. We think that the time is ripe for us to do something about it as financial educators, and we feel constrained by the capacity of our classrooms. So how do we leverage our capabilities, and how do we reach the broader community? And we think the answer is finance, education, and technology. So we want to bring the power of financial education to everyone, not just those who are in our classrooms. Now, what are we doing? What can we do about it as financial educators? Well, we've been researching capital markets for decades. I've been in this field for 20 years, learning, researching, and educating others, and so is Stephen, and so is our PhD students. So there's a lot of kind of intellectual time that we spend researching these ideas, but how do we communicate to others? Well, one answer would be to build a powerful and inclusive platform, a platform that disseminates financial data analysis and financial education to everyone, regardless of their financial background and degree of financial acumen. Providing access to everyone to institutional-grade financial data analysis tools, and ultimately equalizing access to informed decision-making. Now, vision without execution is hallucination. And Stephen and I, we don't like to hallucinate. So over the last 1 year, we tried to make most of the extra time that we had from not attending some of the meetings and to move to the next step, which is everything that we've been thinking for years to make it happen. So actually today we're celebrating 1 year since we kicked off development of a platform designed for individual investors, We call it YOLO. Why? Because a cool platform has to have a cool name. So let me give you the story. So it was around the time of the GameStop frenzy, and I was teaching financial data analysis at Berkeley Has, and my students were like, Panos, you'd be spending all these years teaching financial data analysis. We don't think it matters anymore. I'm like, no, not too fast. Financial data analysis matters even more now. And I'll prove it to you. That was the time that YOLO, this idea that you only live once, right? It was colliding with everything I believed in, the value of financial education. So I'm like, we have to do something about it. And that's how the name came up. YOLO plus OWL, which represents the wisdom of financial educators. And that's what we're trying to instill. So let me explain. So we're trying to complete the investment process, everything that happens before people buy and sell securities. And if you think of any trading platform, that's all you get access to, buying and selling. But how do you go to informed decision making? Well, you have to complete the investment process. That's what we do in our classrooms. From searching the universe of stocks for ideas using advanced data analytics that so far has been accessible only to institutional investors, to sophisticated forecasting and valuation, things that traditionally are only reserved for institutional investors. Now, we talked about, again, I'm going back to American Airlines and the CEO talking about forecasting and quarterly forecasting and the pressure to perform on a quarterly basis. Well, there's been a tremendous interest in forecasting quarterly earnings per share, the metric that the managers are trying to hit and the analysts are trying to forecast, right? But so far, that game, the short-term game, the game of institutional forecasting, was only accessible to institutional investors. So what we're trying to do using advanced data analytics, real-time, we try to provide the most powerful and interactive do-it-yourself forecasting platform for individual investors. We're trying to give investors the story behind the Wall Street analyst. What needs to happen for this forecast to make sense? What's the upside? What's the downside? And what are the risks around earnings announcements? But we don't stop there because we understand we shouldn't just be living our lives as if there is only one quarter ahead. So we're thinking about the long term. Many investors are trying to make sense of prices, what is driving value. Many people are asking me, what needs to happen for today's stock price of Tesla to be justified over time? And I can do this type of analysis. Individual investors are hungry to understand what's driving prices. So we built a proprietary algorithm, and this is based on our research, things that we've been teaching for decades, but has only been accessible to our students. A machine that basically reverse engineers in real time the fundamental story behind the price. That is, what needs to happen over time for today's price in real time to be justified? What kind of sales, what kind of profits Tesla will need to achieve over time for today's price to make sense? So we're giving the story behind the price, but also the ability of investors to challenge the market and tell their own story. See what the price would have been if the vision of the market is not being realized. So this is really institutional-grade financial analysis at the fingertips of investors. You can challenge the analysts and challenge the market and tell your own story. Now that we have the tools and now that we built this incredible financial calculator, now we're ready for Act 2 in this longer play, in this bigger play, in our quest for equal access to informed decision-making and financial education for everyone. So having the platform, all these tools that we developed over the years, and making those accessible to everyone is important, but at the same time, we shouldn't stop there. Financial education is important, but financial education is not accessible to everyone, right? It should be more accessible to everyone in the law profession, outside of the law profession, but also to individual investors. We're in the business, or we are in the mission, we have the mission to change the market for financial data, to reinvent financial education, and to make financial education and informed decision-making more accessible to everyone. Now, this is really bridging the gap between research and practice and actually putting our time and our money where our mouth is in terms of our belief in financial education. So what we've done is we created this company. It's called YOLO Incorporated. It's a public benefit corporation, but unlike other PBCs, we intend to walk the talk and stay true to our mission, which is promoting financial education. So I invite you to download the app, experiment with it. You already got it? Yeah. Excellent. So experiment with it, share it with your students, share it with your colleagues, and send us your feedback. This is the first step in the broader mission of democratizing access to financial education for everyone. Thank you very much.